Hi, everybody. Uh, Welcome to my closet classroom here. So this is the only classroom that's not occupied right now. So we're in the back room here. Let me know if it's too loud in the chat there. And if it is, then we'll find a different place. But for now, this is what we're going to be for class. It's not the worst place I've taught before. I'm going to see about just looking around for something to stack under my iPad here, and then I'll be getting that organized. So just one second. So this is the, unfortunately, easiest way for me to do a live stream is to have various things arranged this way. So again, I will post, as always, I'll post the notes when they're ready, when they're done. So let's see how that looks. Boy, it looks like nothing so far. Okay, let's see how this goes. A few more options for visualizing might have been nice. The way I want it to look, I guess. One screen in front of the other. I will see about doing a different approach next time, but for now, this will have to do. So that will be, yeah, okay. That looks okay to me. So hopefully you're able to catch this and watch. At this point, we are going to be stuck with this kind of approach for a little while. The community center is closed, so we can't teach there for the foreseeable future, at least. I believe that they are reopening on the 10th as well, which is the same day as the schools are reopening. So as of April 10th, both the school and the community center are going to be reopened, and then we can have our classes back there at that point. Okay, so let's get started. So we've been talking about the evolution of a gene pool, and so as part of the evolution of the gene pool, we were talking about the 5 agents of change. So these 5 agents of change include small populations, non-random mating, mutation, movement or gene flow, and then the idea of natural selection. So I want to go through each of those individually and think about how they affect the allele concentration, or the alleles, and how they affect the variation in those alleles. So in the case of mutations, this is a source for new alleles. So with a mutation, you're creating something that wasn't there before, and that new allele that you're creating is going to be that new allele is something that was never there before, and it therefore changes the population. It changes the frequency of genes. There was 2 genes, and the frequency can be 50-50. As soon as you add a 3rd gene, then it's not 50-50 anymore. It's it's 30-30-30 or something like that. So mutations, they occur constantly. We've talked about this a little bit in class, but every generation of human being gains 3 new mutations. Generations of bacteria, they gain mutations a little bit slower, but within your DNA, you are always getting new forms. And even in when we compare 2 cells, we might have new genes. Now, those mutations are not necessarily those mutations are not necessarily going to be passed on to the next generation. In the case of evolution, we're most concerned with genes that are passing on to the next generation. So, for example, cancer, many forms of cancer are caused by mutations of the genome that are spontaneous, they're random, And those spontaneous and random mutations, they will not be passed along because usually cancer is in a cell that's not a reproductive cell. So if you get skin cancer, for example, it's more than likely that that skin cancer is an isolated change. It could be from, say, exposure to ultraviolet radiation or, a chemical exposure, whatever the cause. But the change is at a specific site of the skin, and it might spread to other cells around it, or it might spread to other parts of the body. But most likely, it does not spread to the reproductive cells, and the reproductive cells will carry forward a copy of the genes that the parent had before they had cancer. But there are mutations but just as there can be mutations in skin cells, there can also be mutations in your reproductive cells. Every time your cells go to reproduce through mitosis and meiosis, there are chances that there are mistakes made in the reproduction of the DNA, and those mistakes will be carried on to the next generation. So this way, the population, the gene pool gets additional traits every generation, and occasionally these traits become important to the survival of the population. But it doesn't matter about survival right now. All we want to talk about is that a gene pool can change by mutation. So mutations, they change the gene pool because they add new traits. Okay. Let's switch to the gene flow. Gene flow is the idea that if you take two different populations of the same species, so groups that have the ability to reproduce, take two different groups of organisms that have the ability to reproduce and combine them, you'll most likely get a new allele frequency that is different from the previous ones. So in this example that they've given us here, we have a population of green beetles and a population of brown beetles, maybe from two different locations. And when these two populations are joined, the gene frequency goes from 100% green and 100% brown to 100% brown and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So, and 6/7 green and 1/7 brown. So we can maybe we'll make a little note. I might go through later, and just because of the awkwardness of this setup here, I might go through later and do these notes separately. But originally, we have 100% green. And then now it's only 6/7 green. So the frequency has changed. We have a change in frequency. And this is the idea behind how gene flow can cause changes in frequency. We usually cannot prevent this sort of action from happening. We can't prevent organisms from changing places or from moving over time, and so we are kind of trapped in that way. That this is likely a part of genetic modification or evolution in many, many different cases that genes will flow. Ooh, I don't like that setup. I'd like to try to get it so it's sort of more vertical here, if I can. Okay. I can bring this all the way up to here. That's a little better. Okay. As a screen on a screen is a little bit of an awkward thing. I guess I can kind of poke my head out over top. No, I don't like that. Okay. If you have any questions at any time, just please drop them in the chat and I'll try to address them as best as I can. That's one of the reasons I want to do the live stream, is so that I can get some feedback from you and other details. I will likely post some other videos that detail some of the other things that you should read or watch, or any of the videos we would normally watch in class. I will post those onto the classroom in a playlist. Okay, so that's gene flow. There are also there's also the agent of non-random mating. I thought I had another thing about gene flow I wanted to say. This includes emigration, so you could also think about individuals moving away from a population. So for this population over here, we didn't actually change the gene distribution, but perhaps if there had been some green members on this side, we could think that them moving away does also impact the gene distribution at the original site. Certainly, in the case of somewhere like well, in one case, for example, the golden retriever was immigrated from Europe. There was a single mating pair, or maybe 3 dogs, I think, that they brought over from Europe to form all of the golden retrievers in North America. So all North American golden retrievers draw their bloodline to 3 individual golden retrievers that were brought over. And so we can look at the greater dog population in North America and think about how that dog population was impacted by these 3 golden retrievers brought over by this dog breeder. And also, those 3 dogs were removed from the gene pool of the golden retrievers in Europe. And these 3 golden retrievers that were brought over, they ended up bringing with them some specific traits, which caused the North American and European golden retrievers to look slightly different from each other. Okay, so that's that example. We are now on to the non-random mating idea. We can again go to these golden retrievers and think about them as an example of non-random mating. Non-random mating is any case where the selection of mates is outside of the animal's control. So, in the case of the golden retrievers, they were brought over by humans who controlled which mating pairs they could have. Much of artificial selection, the ability to create the ability that humans use to control breeding. Humans control breeding in artificial selection, and that is really a factor of non-random mating. So in non-random mating, the choice of mates is often an important part of behavior, the important part of the natural selection process, and plants often self-pollinate as well. So what can I say about non-random mating? So when mating plays an important role in the reproduction of a population or the survival of a population, then it has an important role in shaping the gene pool over time. That's what I'm trying to get at. So let's look at an example of, say, Darwin's finches. So Darwin proposed the idea that the European finch landed on the Galapagos Islands. Once those finches land on the Galapagos Islands, the choice of mates has become limited. Those finches can no longer choose mates from the greater continental finches. They have to choose mates from the population that's on that island. So the population has been controlled, or the mating's been controlled. In other cases, we see non-random mating appearing in examples like the peacock, where only males with very large tail feathers will find mates successfully, and so in that way, those males have a selection factor. Their chance of mating is not random. It's based on how big their tail feathers are. We can compare this to maybe random mating. So in some cases, we could look at random mating like in the case of, say, some types of fish. So in the case of some types of fish, the female will lay eggs, and then the males will spray the eggs with their sperm, and there will be a selection of males that will be in the area that can all try to fertilize the eggs equally, and their chance of success is relatively random. It's not because of one fish being better or smarter or faster or more aggressive. It's actually a random effect. If you leave a dog pack loose, the dog pack, if it's in a big enough population, then the mating might be random as well, or it might be because the males are more aggressive. It gets a little bit harder to control. But the reason we talk about non-random mating as a method of evolution is because it is one that we use. We as human beings have used effectively for a long time through non-random mating programs that have been used to domesticate animals and plants. All right. The next one is genetic drift. This is a challenging concept to wrap your hand around because it does depend on a knowledge of randomness. So genetic drift is the idea that life is not guaranteed. The world is there's a harshness in the world where random events may happen that will impact the chance of success. So there's lots of different examples of chance to consider. I'm just going to write a couple out here, and then I'll bring this back to you. But so some examples of chance that we can consider would be the chance of finding a mate. So finding a mate, consider something like an endangered species where there aren't a lot of that species around. The chance of actually finding a mate might be small, and that could have a big impact on their survival. And in that case, then randomly, those that just happen to be more closely located will have a higher chance of survival than those that don't. This could be a random event. We also have random events like poaching and death, essentially. Any events that could randomly eliminate individuals from the gene pool. So death might be random. Death, hunting, or predation, I guess. How about death by predation? Predation here means to have a predator get you, caught you, or being a prey to something. That's probably pretty random. Wolves are not looking at rabbits going like, oh, that one's the one I want to eat because I know that this one has brown fur and that one has slightly less brown fur. That's not how wolves work. They don't select their prey. They are running around and then they smell something and they go, oh, that's the one I'm going to get, and they go and they just grab it. They don't. There's no control there. It might just be random. The random rabbit that ran across their path. Environmental. Environmental effects as well are random. I mean, I suppose if you were a specialist in weather, you might say they're not random, but I think there are still some environmental effects here. Okay, so I'll put that back. So in this way, if we have to consider the effects of random events, then these random events will so the cause of these random effects cause changes in the gene pool. If you have a population that is equally distributed between dark and light-haired rabbits, for example, and suddenly a lightning strike comes out and it kills 10 rabbits by random chance, and that's like half the population, well, maybe you just lost all the rabbits that were able to mate and reproduce with that light hair gene. So the next generation suddenly becomes darker in hair color, not because lighter hair was the favorable color, but because the light ones were just randomly eliminated from the gene pool. There are a lot of evolutionary theorists who are interested in this random event idea, this genetic drift, because there are some who argue that perhaps genetic drift, these random events, actually play a larger role in the evolution of some organisms. Some of the traits that organisms carry that are not adapted to their environment, but they don't provide too much of a drawback. Those might be explained by them being the random offshoots of their surviving ancestors. So at some point in the past, perhaps an ancestor, survives some tragic event that killed off a large portion of their population, and those surviving ancestors carry with them some sort of trait that isn't favorable. But now the population has a larger proportion of that trait. So this genetic drift occurs in two interesting ways. It particularly occurs in small populations. So random chance is increased by small population. So I'm going to put a little note here. The genetic drift. Genetic drift is mostly in effect in small population. Mostly, or strongest effect. Has strongest effect on a small population. And this is probably why we are most concerned with the environmental effects on endangered species over the effect on species that are already well established. So when we think about something like climate change, for example, so climate change as a bulk effect, it's somewhat random, right? It's human. It originates from humans, but its effects are random in terms of like having effects on the environment and having causing large swings in environmental change. And these large swings in environmental change, when they impact large population animals, like say our rabbits, we got rabbits everywhere. If the environment, shifts to be a couple degrees hotter or a couple degrees colder, it's probably not going to have a huge impact on the rabbit population because there are so many rabbits. And so when there is a large random swing to be extra hot one year, we might lose some rabbits, but the number of rabbits that we lose probably will not impact the whole population. Meanwhile, something like the whooping crane, which at one point there was only 15 in the whole world, that population is very small. So a random event like a shift towards a couple of degrees warmer or colder, or a longer winter or a shorter winter, could have a huge impact, because out of that small population of whooping cranes, you might have a high impact. Even if they lost 10 individuals, that might be a huge impact on that small population. And those 10 individuals out of 1,000 compared to 10 rabbits out of a million rabbits, you are looking at very much greater impact. Those 10 mating individuals removed from the gene pool means that the next gene pool is going to be very different. So random events like genetic drift have a much higher impact on small populations than they do on large populations. It's just an effect of numbers. So we're interested in a couple of ways that we could get small numbers. and what ways those could, what origins there could be for those small numbers of individuals. One option is that so small populations are extremely vulnerable to the effects of genetic drift. The law of large numbers in statistics stipulates that the smaller the population, the bigger the effect a change will have. Genetic drift in small populations most likely follows one of two patterns. So the two patterns we're going to discuss in our class are the bottleneck effect. So the bottleneck effect is when a population is limited in its ability to reproduce. And so we have a large population, but only some of those individuals are able to reproduce. Or the founder effect, where we have one population that is reproducing, and then a portion of that population leaves to some other location and continues to reproduce, but its composition will be different from the original population. Both are based in random chance. So let's talk about the bottleneck here. Here you can see an example of a bottleneck occurring. We have a large vial of beads. They range from blue and yellow, and they seem to be about 50-50. And then when we shake out just a random small amount of beads and then use the ratio of beads to reproduce the next population, where we're representing a limited number of reproducing individuals, we find that the resulting population has a new composition. If we compare these two compositions, we see we went from 50-50 to something more like 75-25, more blue. So this is the idea that a population bottleneck occurs in a population whose size is dramatically reduced for at least one generation. This type of reduction could be from poaching. Poaching is a really good example, or hunting. So human beings have caused this type of reproduction, this type of bottleneck in the bison. So humans especially when the Europeans came over to North America through colonization, they started overhunting the bison for their pelts. And unlike the sort of more holistic living the more holistic hunting that was going on before the Europeans came over, they overhunted them to near extinction. And so the bison population fell, and only a small number were able to reproduce for the next generation. So if we were able to go back in time and grab a bison from pre-1890 and compare them to the bisons of today, we would probably find that the distribution of traits would be very different. So you'll notice a little note here in my file that says that the population is usually typically requires more than 50% of the population to be killed before we see a large change in the genome. So small effects like, a little bit of overhunting here and there, it's probably not going to have a huge effect, but a progressive or excessive poaching and hunting will. It could also be through a disease effect. So you could certainly have a disease that came in and affected who was able to reproduce. You could have a social effect, possibly. There's been one study of there was one study of the Y chromosomes in Europe, and they found that because of the feudal system, the Y chromosome, which is directly inherited from your father, the Y chromosome has more commonalities across the European population, because during the feudal system, the lord in charge of a general area had some less than pleasant rights over reproduction of women. He was able to go in and claim any woman for himself, or to have multiple wives, and have multiple sons. It was in their favor to have multiple heirs. And those heirs, because they were rich, would have a higher chance of survival compared to the peasant farmers. And so over time, the Y chromosome became more representative of the aristocracy or the higher ups in those areas. So now we carry a legacy in European males where they have more common features in their Y chromosome than they should if mating was random. There's another non-random mating effect, but it's also a limited. It is also a sort of a random effect from controlling who was able to reproduce for the next generation and which ones would be surviving. So the animal examples we have in our booklet include the bison, the cheetah. Cheetahs at this point, they are so genetically similar because of the bottlenecks that they can actually accept skin grafts from each other. And if you know anything about human skin grafts, humans can't even accept skin grafts from parts of their own body sometimes. So in a human, you usually would graft skin from some other part of your body onto a part. Like, so if you get a burn, I've heard of getting skin from your back of your leg or whatever and getting it grafted onto your face. And usually that will be good, but getting skin donations from another human being is actually very difficult, and your body has a high a high chance of rejection. Meanwhile, if you did the same thing for cheetah, all of the cheetahs have almost the same genetics because of the bottlenecks that they've experienced in their time being hunted. That we can actually take skin from one cheetah and transfer it onto another one without rejection. This is pretty wild, I think. And then what is my other example there? The giant tortoise on the Galapagos Islands. So there was a population of tortoises on the Galapagos Islands, and they were separated by a random event, a volcano that erupted, and it created a lava flow that divided the island into two halves. The tortoises that were found on one side of the island versus the other were randomly distributed before the volcano went off. And then since the time of that volcano, those populations have become very different, to the point where the two types of tortoises nowadays can't even mate with each other. Excuse me. All right. And that's what 100,000 years will do. And the reason that they can't mate with each other is because of the final method of the final change, and that would be natural selection. But before we get to that, let's talk about the founder effect. So previously we were talking about one population. We're talking about one population that gets shrunk so that only a small number of them can reproduce. Now we're going to talk about one population where a small portion of them travels away and becomes their own population. So this would be any time that organisms are allowed to divide. This could be because of a random event like a flood. A flood could take a population that was surrounding a valley on all through the valley, and then the flood comes in and it creates a lake in the middle. And now the two sides of the valley are no longer the same species. Species can't breed across the lake. And so over time, these two species become different. And that's because of whatever genetics the two populations had. So you can see the example here where we have one large population, and this large population has three different offshoots. So maybe like in the finches example, so in Darwin's finches, groups of those finches were able to populate separate islands, but that initially might have been a random distribution. That might have been randomly groups of random finches, all the same type, with similar genetics, but not the same frequency of genetics that the large population has. So notice that this group up here is have only red squares, and this group here has, 2 red squares and 3 blue squares, and this population here is all blue. Meanwhile, the original group that they come from is a 50-50 population. This would be like if I take a deck of cards and you randomly select 3 cards from that deck. What are the chances that, or even select 4 cards? What are the chances that those 4 cards are going to be 2 black cards and 2 red cards? Honestly, it's probably still pretty low. It's likely, but if you only do it once, then it's very unlikely that it'll be perfect the first time. It's a possibility, but it's not. It's not guaranteed. And because it's not guaranteed, it's based on chance. That makes it genetic drift. So any of these founder effects, the founder effects are going to be fairly common. The original population will still survive as well in the founder effect. So maybe in the case of we talked about the emu and the ostrich, for example. Those emus and ostriches may have been all the same species. And then as the population was divided by the continents shifting away, the groups were randomly separated. And this random separation could be thought of as a founder effect. We split the, let's imagine, I don't know, I'm not sure which one's older, but maybe the emu population is the oldest, right? And then the emu population is split amongst the 3 continents. And now one of those continents goes on to slowly evolve over time because it has a different type of trait than that are popular, or it has a different distribution of traits than the emu population has. And so over time, they become more and more different because they had these different traits plus other effects. So there's a couple of examples in humans that we've seen and tracked. One of them is the Hutterite colonies. So in Hutterite colonies, where they have a smaller gene pool to choose from, they don't. They at least traditionally were controlling their mating and not breeding outside of the colonies. And in these groups, they noticed that spinal muscular atrophy is a much higher rate of much higher genetic frequency than we see in the greater human population, North American population. And that's because the group is an offshoot from the larger population. Another example is this very rare disease called Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome, and it is a rare form of dwarfism, and it is a 0.1% rate. A second, I can't read upside down. So this syndrome is found in about 7% of the population of the Pennsylvanian Amish, but in the larger North American population or European population that they descend from, we see only a 0.1% in frequency. So this is a change in frequency. It's over time. We're comparing a group that originally separated in the 1700s with a group with today. So in 300 years, we have seen a change in frequency from 0.1% up to 7% today. So that's evolution, right? So we've got over 300 years. We went from 0.1%, assuming the population was had the same frequency originally when it separated, up to 7%. So that's change over time, which gives us evolution. All right. And the final one, this is the one that we'll spend the most time on, is natural selection. So natural selection is the change in a gene pool over time because of some sort of stress on the environment, or some sort of stress on the population. That's what I think is the best way of thinking about it. It is a change with a particular direction. That all of the other examples, except for possibly non-random mating, have been occurring because of but having random effects on the populations. Natural selection is the only one that has an additive effect or a directed effect. So evolution of a gene pool occurs because there is variation between the traits of individuals, giving some an advantage over others in the presence of a hostile environment. So it assumes a hostile environment, much like genetic drift does. But in this case, because the stress is continuous and small, it's relatively small and continuous, it causes a directed effect. Over many generations, the variations that have an easier time surviving and reproducing will dominate the gene pool. Eventually, the traits will become the common traits among individuals, changing the gene pool. These traits that assist reproductive success are called adaptations. So natural selection is the only one that can result in adaptations. Sometimes we could look at non-random mating, like artificial selection, as sort of making adaptations, but they don't necessarily increase survival. Natural selection may be assisted through mutations and non-random mating, but gene flow and genetic drift are purely random effects. And so mutations are also random, and so they don't actually contribute to this type of action. You might initially have a genetic drift and then natural selection takes over on, say, a founder effect, but that's a little bit different. Darwin, Charles Darwin, is the one who sort of came up with this idea. He had a theory of descent with modification, and his conclusion was that the process of natural selection could be extrapolated to explain how life originated from one shared ancestry. So each of these different agents causes changes to genetic frequency over time. This is why analyzing genetic frequency is such a powerful tool for studying evolution. So I just want to make one last note here about about natural selection. So let's say that we could say something like this: natural selection. I'll dictate as I write. So natural selection is a change due to a continuous stress on a gene pool causing non-random survival and reproduction. So those that reproduce have a higher frequency of carrying favorable traits. I think that kind of makes sense. Okay, well, close enough. So what I'm going to say here is, what I want to get to the point of is that we really want to look at natural selection as being a non-random effect. And in fact, that's a very key part of accepting natural selection. So natural selection is a change due to a continuous stress on a gene pool, causing non-random survival and reproduction. Those that reproduce have a higher frequency of carrying favorable traits, also known as adaptations. Oops. Let's just go live. So that's the idea. Natural selection is non-random we get these changes that happen in a continuous way. Usually it's a stress. So stresses could be, a type of environment where there's a greater chance of survival if you're a certain fur color, or it could be from it could be a variety of results. But, so for example, let's say the Arctic. The Arctic is a continuous stress on populations because the Arctic is cold. The Arctic is white in general from the snow. So if a population of, say, foxes were, trapped on a little glacier and they slid into the Arctic, and now you have a group of foxes, all different colors of fur. The ones with the lighter colored fur are probably going to have an easier time hiding and hunting and surviving in the winter. And so they will end up reproducing more often. And so the next generation will have more of that white fur trait in it. And then the generation after that will have more of white fur traits. And the generation after that, it's not going to only be white foxes that survive that first year, but over time, the white foxes have a non-random chance of success. They have a slightly better than average chance. And so they will slowly become the dominant form in the gene pool. Okay. I have a very fun little graphic about a little section here about analyzing gene pools. I think we'll get into that on another day. I think we're going to end the stream here. So hopefully you had a good time. 45 minutes in a closet is enough time for me. So we'll talk to you tomorrow, same time, noon. I will have another stream for you, and we will go over the next section. And eventually I will post some assignments into the Google Classroom as well. So best of luck. If you need anything from me, just send me an email and or send me a message through Classroom. Okay, have a great day.